Welcome to the webinar. You have entered as an organizer and may now speak to any other organizers or panelists on the line. When you are ready to begin the presentation, press the Start Broadcast button on the GoToWebinar control panel to allow all attendees to hear you. This system will notify you once you begin your broadcast. The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, How to Create a Robust Disaster Recovery Plan. My name is Olivier Menel, and I am the Events and Communications Officer at Connecting Up and TechSoup New Zealand. Our webinar today will be presented by Dr. Carlson Hall, who is the Director of IT Connection. A recording of this presentation and a copy of the slides will be sent to you all in the next couple of days, and from then you'll be able to access them at any time on our website. If you have a question during the webinar, please type it in the question box on your webinar panel and we will answer them throughout at the end of the webinar. If you have any technical issue, please also type it in the question box. I'd now like to hand over to Carlson. It's all you.
Thank you, Ollie, and Connecting Up for organising this webinar, and thank you for attending. There may be several reasons why you attend today. Maybe you experienced a disaster in the past. Maybe you were given a task to develop a disaster plan and want some pointer to start. This webinar will give you a practical guide to develop your disaster recovery plan, and I hope you enjoy your time with me today, and more importantly, have some takeaway back to your workplace afterwards. These are the agenda and the main topics that we'll go through today. We'll take roughly about 30 minutes to go through the presentation. There'll be a Q&A session at the end. However, I do encourage you to use the chat facility to ask any questions along the way. My lovely assistant here, Heidi, will help me read through the chat sessions and answer any question along the way or at the end of the presentation. To start with, where we'll have a quick look at the key driver behind a DR plan. It's important to understand some of the key fundamentals of a disaster recovery as it will allow you to focus on important matters. Then we'll look at the components that make up a disaster recovery plan. Risk analysis is probably one of the most important components. We'll highlight the area that you should consider and then the steps that you need to build a robust plan. We'll then take a quick look at cloud computing and how you can utilize this technology within your planning. So before we jump into the presentation, just a few questions. We'll probably use the online poll. And these questions will kind of give us an indication of the profile of our audience today, and we'll use example, then we're able to apply better examples that are more appropriate to you. Can I pass the control back to you, Ollie, to run the poll?
Yeah, sure, I'll just launch it.
Okay. Okay, 95% come from the not-for-profit sector.
Okay, then next poll.
You're able to select. Maybe your center. D plus. Very good. Okay. So it's not the same. Yes. Okay, 65% don't have one. Okay, thank you, Ollie. Ollie, would the attendants able to see the result of the poll?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
The attendants, are they able to see the result of the poll?
Yes,
Should
they could
I
see.
sort of?
Yes, they could see the result.
They can see that. Okay, all right, yep. So 95% of audience today come from the not-for-profit sector, and close to half of you come from organisations with 50 plus staff, and close to 80% of our attendants today have some responsibility with the IT operation, and 65% of you are in the process, I guess, to build a disaster recovery plan. Okay, so hopefully your disaster recovery plan doesn't resemble in anything like this image, but don't feel bad if it does, because you're taking the right step to make sure this isn't you in the future. So what is the disaster recovery plan? We all know we have a growing reliance on computer system nowadays. For some organization, data in the computer system is become an important asset. Think of the client data, research data, finance information. The data is now part of the intellectual property of your company. And for some, the operation is highly dependent on the IT system. Think of point of sale system, e-commerce, or in not-for-profit, you may run a helpline, which depending on your phone system, your IT system database as well. A disaster can be defined as anything that has the ability to impact a business, your stakeholder in any shape or form. It could be man-made disaster, like fire or natural disaster such as a flood. It may even be less threatening disasters such as surge in electricity that cause your equipment to burn out. So we all want to prevent disaster from happening. If we can't prevent them, we want to reduce the risk, reduce the likelihood of it happening. Alternatively, we can have a plan B to deal with it when it happens. Or simply accept, in some case, just to accept that it may happen, and then we deal with it when it happens. In general, a disaster recovery plan will involve a impact and risk assessment that covering as many scenarios as you can, some testing strategies or scenario run through, and then some execution plan, including an action communication plan, and some sort of step-by-step recovery instruction during a disaster. So if you have a well-written disaster recovery plan, you can ensure your organization can act in an efficient and effective manner when a disaster occurs. But more importantly, this document become a communication tool for you to your stakeholders. You can give them the assurance, or you're able to identify gaps that need to be bridged as part of your next IT strategy plan. So let's start. The primary objectives in any organization is ultimately to protect the data and the intellectual property. And secondly, our desire is to restore business operation in a timely manner, and this is what we call business continuity. And disaster recovery plan generally is part of that business continuity. Because most of our audience come from a not-for-profit sector, another driver we commonly encounter is compliance. It's not uncommon for your board to ask for a disaster recovery plan to be ready in order to protect the interests of the organization. And we also find more and more government tenders nowadays require you to submit and have a disaster recovery plan as part of the condition of your tender. So let's look at some of the couple of disaster recovery fundamentals, concepts. It may sound a bit technical, but just bear with me and let me explain and hopefully simplify them for you. So the two most important concepts, they are the recovery time objectives and the recovery point objective. Essentially, it is referring to two key elements during a disaster, which are the time and data. Time is referred to how quickly we can restore the system, and data is how much of the current data we can afford to lose. Okay, I will discuss this time and data in more detail in the next slide. Another two concepts in the fundamental are the recovery classes and the 70s of disaster recovery, which we'll cover. Okay, let's start with data, which is the recovery point objective. And it's basically defined that how much data you can afford to lose in a disaster recovery scenario. So let's take your backup as an example and assume you're doing a nightly backup. In this case, you can say your recovery point objective is within 24 hours. So if you have a server crash or a hard disk failure, you should be able to restore the data from the previous day. So is that the right assumption? So let me give you a different example, a different scenario. Let's say your server room is destroyed by flood because your air conditioner was spewing out water, or you have a burglar ransack your office, or even a disgruntled employee deliberately delete your file or your backup. In these sort of scenarios, you will have no access to your previous day backup. So your recovery point in this sort of scenario will be your last offsite copy, maybe, if you're lucky to have one. Okay, so for the time component, recovery time, it's the time that required to restore your system to a point where you can begin to operate a business. So if you encounter a server crash, as an example, and your recovery procedure may say, in this scenario, you have to go and buy a server, and then you run it up and then configure it, and then you restore your server, your data from the backup. And then your expected recovery time may be looking at anything between 3 days, maybe up to a week or more. So in this scenario, if your business objective is 3 days, and that means your business can sustain up to 3 days of downtime, and if you find your server recovery takes, let's say, 5 days, then basically you identify you have a gap of 2 days where you need to work on. So computer network technology has developed a scheme by categorizing the time and data objectives into 4 classes. Most of us are in the class 1 and 2 categories. Class 1 basically defined as recovery time objectives of anything between 3 days and a week. And the data point is from the last full backup, which is anything from up to a week. Whereas in class 2, typically, where I think most company would be like to be in at a minimum. Basically, it defined a company cannot afford more than a day of data loss and no more than 3 days of downtime. And 3 and 4 are for the sort of the bigger company where they have a lot of transactions or dealing with very sensitive data or there's significant productivity lost. And companies in these two classes generally have much higher demand in terms of instant recovery and minimal data loss. So what class are you in now and what class do you need to be in? So that's a two different things, and keep that in mind as we move towards this presentation about building your disaster recovery plan. Another concept of disaster recovery is the 7 T's introduced by IBM. Basically, to describe the level of redundancy in mitigating a disaster. A lot of our audience here probably will be in the T0 to maybe up to T3. Basically, that means you will have some sort of backup. You may not have some sort of spare equipment where you can replace and restore your faulty components quickly. From T4 onwards, we're talking about real-time replication and potentially sort of massive failover redundancy outside your premises. So I won't go into those tiers as you know. Our audience today is mainly between the T0 and T3. The reason we mentioned this because the higher the tiers you go, the costs are going to be exponentially high, as we illustrate in this graph. Think of the banks, the stock exchange. These are the companies that demands a Tier 7 disaster recovery system, and generally the costs are astronomical. Our aim as a small business or as a not-for-profit organization is to invest in solutions that are most critical to our business. So if we're realistic and be very focused, we can gradually improve our disaster recovery situation, even if we have limited budget and resource. Obviously, we want zero downtime, but sometimes downtime and disaster can occur outside of our control. And that's why we need a plan so that we can be in control. There are 4 key steps that we recommend in writing your DR plan. There are many considerations, of course, but I'll explain in details in the coming slide. Okay, the first step, and probably the most important step in your DR plan, is the risk and impact analysis. Essentially, this involves identifying the most critical business function for your organization. If you're a large organization, you need to do this analysis with each of the business unit. The process generally involves a detailed discussion with the person with the most knowledge of the particular business unit, whether it's in production, operation, a call center, finance, sales, and marketing. Your discussion really needs to cover the minimum system and capability of function during disaster. Right. You also need to look at the possible threats and vulnerability, both internal and external, that will impact the business unit ability to conduct the business. Right. Some of the scenario you will need to consider. An area is loss of data, such as server failure, hard drive failure. It should also include accidental, such as someone accidentally deletes some files, as well as some malicious one where there's digital employee deliberately deleting files. Another key area is the loss of IT function, such as widespread virus. Perhaps the vendor out of business, no longer supporting the version of the software that you're using. Also consider the loss of skill, such as illness or accidental accident that's fallen on key personnel within your organization, and these people could be the only one within your organization who can operate a particular function. You also need to consider loss of assets, such as losing access to your facility, your building, by means of fire, storm, flood, and a more common known cause is also extended power outage. So once you identify this scenario, our next step is to assess the likelihood of occurrence and the impact on the business. This is what we call the risk factor matrix. So your assessment of both likelihood, impact, they will vary from company to company, and even from a business unit to another business unit. So let's take an example. Your finance department may be quite okay if there's an extended outage on your telephone system, for example. But if your core business is to provide a 24-hour hotline for vulnerable people under a government contract, the impact without a phone system will be a lot more severe than your finance department. Okay, if I give you a different example for likelihood assessment, if your staff profile is, let's say, generally fairly IT savvy, and you have been providing education to your staff about virus, internet scam, spyware, and you invest in good security system like good firewall, good antivirus software, then your likelihood of a widespread virus outbreak will be a lot less likely than if your organization allow people to bring their own device to work, or you don't have a company computer usage policy, for example. So you can use this matrix as a guide as to your strategies in dealing with the risk. So if you have an old server which is likely to break down, and if a server failure is going to have a very big impact, then you are in the high likelihood and high impact quadrant. It's the right top hand corner, and you should consider a prevention strategies, such as have a plan to replace your server or introduce some redundancy or even increase your backup frequency. And if your assessment of risk is high, but the impact is low, then you may consider a containment strategies where your aim is to reduce the chance of the risk. If I use the virus example again, you may recommend a strategy to provide more staff training or have a sort of a tighter security policy. And if the risk is considered unlikely to occur, but if it does occur, it will have a significant impact, such as extended power outage, resulting in your phone system not operational for a 24-hour hotline services. Then your strategy is to maybe have a plan B when it occurs. So using the same example, then instead of you can have a diesel generator to make sure the power is on, or you may have an arrangement to divert your incoming call to mobiles or another set of phone system. So finally, the risks that are considered both low and low likelihood and low impact, your strategy may simply be to accept and communicate the situation with your stakeholder when they occur. So in writing your plan, we call it the execution plans. It may vary from organization to organization, but these are the 3 plans that we suggest you to consider. The first one is the action plan, which is used to determine the priority of your recovery. The minimum core staff, the minimum technology that you require to sustain the business operation during the recovery process. And we highly recommend you to have a communication plan in place where you identify your chain of command, how, when, what to communicate to your stakeholders. And you have to remember, you may not have access to your emails or computer system to access your contact list during a disaster. The third plan that you should consider is what we call the detailed recovery plan. This plan covers the steps involved in the actual recovery process. in the scenario of a server crash, your recovery plan should include the system specification of your server, the support and warranty information, dependency of the such as the hardware, software, licensing, and the backup, and finally the step-by-step instructions, so you can estimate the time to perform the recovery. So once you have the execution plan written, you have a few more considerations. Number one, identify a few scenarios or components in your plan for a test run or simulation. Generally, this is generally part of your business continuity exercise. For example, try run your business from a room without access to your main server. That's one way to as a simulation. Another example to do the test is to test your backup restoration on a regular basis. We mentioned the gap before. This is the recovery time and data point objectives of what you can possibly do today versus what your business requires. So if you have a gap that you have identified, they should be addressed at the management level or be incorporated into the company IT plan in the future. And thirdly, remember to store your DR plan offsite in a hard copy whenever you have a new revision. So if what I've gone through before sounds like a lot of work to you or your organization, or you could be on a limited budget and don't have the IT resource and you want to do it yourself, then my advice to you is be realistic and start with a simple plan. It will be still much better than having concentrate on situations that have the most severe impact on your business. And remember, you can add to your DR plan over time. You don't have to be overnight to produce your extra plan. You can take steps, take a whole year, 2 years over time to build up your DR plan. Thirdly, not every solution costs a lot of money. There are a lot of non-IT solutions to IT problems. I have a really good example, a real example. One of our clients in the rural Victoria, they happened to experience an extended power outage, and it was like over 4 days. And they have no access to the building because of OH&S, so they have to relocate the staff to other buildings to work. And some of the staff will work from home. And the outage also occurred during the pay period. And being a family-oriented organization, paying their own staff on time was regarded as top priority. And they have actually considered this scenario in the DR plan. So instead of relying on the recovery of power, building the diesel engine and so forth, they actually have a pre-arrangement with the bank, where the bank can provide them with a hot desk where they can do their payroll and pay their supplier and so forth. So it's a very simple, low-cost, non-IT based solution. So think outside the square. Now, if your DR plan highlight a number of gaps, and your desire, of course, is a prevention or mitigation strategies. For IT system, generally the strategies always be around redundancy at each level of your IT infrastructure. And this is where cloud technology will outshine your in-house infrastructure. Example of well-known cloud technologies are the Office 365, Xero, Salesforce, Basecamp. A lot of DHS programs nowadays are cloud-based, such as CRIS, and versus the older generation program like Iris, QDC, News, their in-house program. The cloud-based program, they're hosted in data center and generally looked after by experts specialized in the business operating. So essentially, they can provide a level of infrastructure and redundancy that generally out of reach of business. Secondly, by migrating your system, part of it to cloud, you simplify your own infrastructure. A simpler infrastructure means overall risk will reduce, your recovery time objective and your recovery point objective will significantly improve. And because you're putting a valuable asset in the company with the cloud provider, you do have to do your research and choose only reputable providers and those who are unlikely to provide business. Strategies, or simply plan B, or acceptance of the risk. Prevention. We also go through the execution plan and strategies. This is what to do when a disaster occurs, which is attainments. You should have an action plan to prioritize your recovery, a communication plan so that each person understands their role, and a detailed recovery plan for the step-by-step recovery procedure. So there may be gaps managing time between what you can achieve today and where your business requirement is. So use the information to communicate to management and for your next IT plan. If a simple plan is better than have no plan, so be realistic and focused, and you can develop your DR plan even with limited budget and resource. And finally, consider cloud technology if you haven't already done so, as it will simplify your DR plan. So that's come to the end of my presentation. Thank you for your audience today, and I hope you have learned something today. As Ollie mentioned, I'm the Director of IT Connection. In business since 2003, we do have a large portfolio of clients from the not-for-profit sector. And this seminar is, again, it's a way for us to contribute back to this important sector of ours. And my contact information is on the questions you may have in the future. I'd love to keep in contact with all our attendees today. So, Ollie, should I pass it back to you?
Sure, so we've got only one question so far, but please, if you've got one, type it in the question box and we will go through them. So Lucy asks, as a backup system, how robust are tapes, and is it advisable to undertake a full restore from time to time to check that all the data is recoverable?
The answer, of course, is yes. Generally, backup, when we have a backup strategy, then we cover three things. Number one is, and the second case is in a disaster recovery scenario where we need to restore the entire system. And then the third scenario we need to cover in any backup strategies is the compliance. The organization that requires data archiving for up to 7 years. So to cover the three areas, tape generally is one method, but nowadays generally we use a mix of backup strategies. For example, if you have tape technology, they're very good for archiving purposes. They're very good for disaster recovery. Very good for off-site storage because the tape is easy to take away. But we also recommend have some form of online backup. For example, not necessarily the entire system, but perhaps a key component or the key database. So for any sort of backup strategies, we of course want to have some sort of restoration. So for a simple file restore, something that you should exercise once a month. So make sure that your backups is working properly. And to look at if you have some sort of spare equipment, spare server, maybe once a year, try to do a full system restore from your tape. That will give you an idea of how long that process will take. So same in today's, we have more and more common backup strategy would also involve some sort of what nests, network storage storage device, and in combination with either an online or some sort of offsite copy. So hopefully that's answer the question, Ollie.
We've got Jason who asks, apart from natural disaster and loss of electricity, what other major risks should be considered in a disaster recovery plan?
Yeah, one of the slides cover that. There is, a lot equipment failure, like your server crash, hard drive crash. Consider loss of skill, what we call. You may have one operation, only some people would know how to drive the IT system. So what happened to them when they have an accident or have extended illness? You need to consider those cases. Viruses is a common cause. You may have heard of CryptoLocker. If you don't treat it quickly enough, sometimes it may impact the whole network. And it's not uncommon that if you have a CryptoLocker in your system, you might have to restore the entire system from the previous backup. So those are the common one. There's also very rarely, but you hear stories in the news about a disgruntled employee. You hear story about a company that they're no longer able to operate after some deliberate sabotage of the system. So this slide here, the scenario that you should think about from a data aspect, loss of IT function, like your, it could be software, your software system, could be your phone system, it could be your internet. So those are things that you need to consider. Again, it varies from company to company. So some scenarios are more likely to occur than the others, and some has more impact than the others.
Thank you. Daniel asks, how can you estimate the budget investment for a disaster recovery plan? Do you base it on employees, on gross profit, on numbers of days you are offline?
If I'm the IT manager, I'll use any way I can to get my budget. So sure, a lot of our clients, a lot of our attendants here, more than 50 people. So from the productivity angle, I think it's a very good argument. We service clients like accountants. The 20 accountants, basically they say, if the computer system is down for an hour, the cost of productivity for them are measured in thousands of dollars. So productivity is one angle we can look at. The ratio, I think Connecting Up has the survey in terms of IT spend. It's roughly about 3 to 5% of the IT cost on average out there. So you do have to consider that as part of your overall IT strategies. Important thing is identify the gap, use your DR plan as a communication tool to your management. So you can tell them, right now we do have a disaster recovery in place, but in the worst case scenario, we may be down for up to a week. And then if you take that argument, take that scenario to a business unit, they may be surprised to say, hey, I thought computer system can be backed up in no time. So there may be gaps in there, and use that information as the starting point to build your business case.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions that are pretty similar and basically ask you, is there a need to have a backup of cloud systems like Google Drive or Office 365 or Dropbox?
Yeah, good question. And there are services out there as well. There's a company called Backuptify, which do cloud backup for you. I guess it will be a case-by-case base. We have clients who have 7 years compliance. They have to keep the data, including all the emails, for up to 7 years. And in those cases, yes, you may have to consider that. But that's more from the compliance reason. So generally, from the DR point of view, you rely on your cloud provider to give you the your recovery point, recovery time objectives. Yes, but certainly there are services out there who will do the online backup and archive of your cloud data.
Speaking of cloud services, Paul asks if Dropbox is reliable when doing a disaster recovery plan.
I guess yes and no. We're talking about, when we do talk about backup of the entire system, generally it varies from organization to organization, but generally we're talking about a large amount of data. And generally the amount of data will be a lot bigger than what you generally get from services like Dropbox. And Dropbox generally is for storage and sharing files with other people. So I would suggest sort of online storage type services. They are not expensive nowadays, and there's plenty of online backup provider out there now. So if you're on a Soho, a very small company, putting things on Dropbox, yes, it's fine, but it's not really a backup solution. It doesn't give you the archive facility either. Yep.
Thank you. Balthazar asks, under the government agreements, would cloud data usage be acceptable?
Under the governance, can you repeat that, Ollie?
Under the government agreements, would cloud data usage be acceptable?
I guess your question is about sovereignty, data sovereignty. Is getting more and more, it's getting being accepted by more and more organizations and by more and more government agencies nowadays. There's certainly councils and agencies that a couple of years ago would not even consider Office 365, and nowadays when we as in my company as an IT provider go and talk to clients in the not-for-profit sector, the sovereignty question has sort of gone away. The large providers such as the Microsoft, they're now building data center in Sydney, and we probably see more and more data center in more sort of local area as well. So that's the way they sort of resolve around the data sovereignty issue. So I'm not really the expert in that. So you do have to take your own advice. It all depends on the sort of the data that you deal with. For certain organizations, they are a lot more sensitive than the others, especially a lot of dealing with the family services. So it is a topic that come up often, but at the same time, if you can separate out your data, if they're client data that are very sensitive, maybe consider them as in-house data, where you can put them in the cloud. Like for example, if you can put your email in the cloud, then you should do it, because running an Exchange server in-house is a very resource-intensive process, and Microsoft and the Google, they do a much better job for that. Do consider Salesforce, Xero, if this doesn't involve a lot of too sensitive information. Yeah. So yeah, 2 years ago, we do have a lot of questions about data sovereignty, but I think it's being accepted by a lot of organizations nowadays.
Thank you. We've got a couple of questions about if you move to the cloud, so to a cloud-based system, is there any way to reduce the risks if the system is down on Microsoft's end, for example?
Well, that's what we tell our client. No matter how well, if we're going to build our own data center, no matter how much money we put in and how good we are, we're not going to build the same system like Microsoft. They have far better expertise. They have way more advanced technology. They're really talking about 99.999% uptime. So very, very difficult to match. So will we experience downtime? Yes. There will be, although the likelihood is low, but there's millions of people on services like Office 365. So you can be pretty certain that Microsoft will be acting on it very, very quickly. And because if there's so many people on Office 365 nowadays, when it's out, generally people know about it as well. So it is a case of likelihood is probably low, although the impact may be high. Generally, the strategy generally is you accept in this case, and if Microsoft had problem, then generally, it's likely the problem that you encounter yourself more likely. Okay.
Thank you, Carlson. So that was the last question. So before I wrap things up, if you've got a question that comes to mind, please feel free to still type it in a chat, in a question box. But would you like anything to say anything before I wrap things up, Carlson?
No, just thank you, Ollie. Thank you, Connecting Up, for organizing this webinar. It's a very good turnout. Yes, we're very pleased. And there's some good questions as well.
All right, well, thank you, Carlson, for presenting today, and thank you everyone for joining us. I hope that this webinar will help you set up a good disaster recovery plan if you don't have one, or we'll help you improve it if you've got one. If you have any question that comes to your mind after the webinar, please feel free to email me at events@connectingup.org and I will forward them to Carlson. And as mentioned earlier, we will send you a link to the webinar recording in the next 2 business days with a copy of the slides. So please keep a lookout in your inbox. And that's it. So thank you again for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Ali.